Are we ready for the introductions then? All right. Okay, well, I'm Karen Hari, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our very own Dr. Lisa Johnson. Lisa is an assistant professor in residence with us. She's been here since fall of 2019. She is the co-director of the field project at Palenque, which is, I think, hopefully everybody knows, one of the major Mayan sites. And she has numerous publications, including in such prestigious venues as Cambridge Archaeological Review and Latin American Antiquity. She also has a forthcoming edited book that should be out this year with the University of Colorado Press that she's co-editing with Rosemary Joyce, called Materializing Temporalities. Sounds interesting. And I also should say that Lisa has just been a really successful grant writer. She's had a winter grant. She's had a dissertation research grant with the University of California Institute for Mexico and the United States. She also received a prestigious postdoctoral fellowship with them, which we are very grateful that she turned down in order to come work with us. So we're so happy to have Lisa with us. And with that, I will let her take it away.
Yeah, that kind of worked out. I would have been stuck in Mexico City during a pandemic if I did that. Thank you very much for the introduction, Karen. And thank you, Esther, as always, for organizing this and facilitating this and playing MC here. So today I will talk a bit about, here, let me share. Let's get this shared. There we go. Did that not work? All right, let me try that again. Hold on. All right, am I in, but I'm not in preview mode, right?
Yeah, you are actually.
That's what I thought.
Mode.
There we go. Is that better? Okay, thank you. All right. So today I am going to talk a little bit about our work in Palenque, and I know for some of you, as I was saying, you may have seen this before because we haven't been able to get into the field to do anything new, but for others, maybe this will be new for you. So for that, I'll also talk a little bit about my background as well. And I just wanted to take a moment just to say, you see the little asterisks on the bottom. There may be a few images of human remains, but where I can, I try to use illustrations instead. So just a note on that. Okay. First of all, I just have to say, as a kid from the trailer parks and a high school dropout, I was actually surprised. I never thought I would have the opportunities that I have had. And sometimes it still amazes me that I have a job where I get to talk about and read about anthropology every day. And I get to travel to these really incredible places. So I don't know if some of it's luck, but I know that a lot of it has to do with the people that I have met along the way. And I've found that sometimes just meeting people, including mentors and peers, may lead to opportunities. So many moons ago, I was an undergraduate at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. And I took a Maya archaeology class with Professor Arlen Chase. And in taking that class, I learned about opportunities to work in their lab on campus, and through that was then invited to the field to participate in their archaeological project at a site, Caracol in Belize. And I absolutely fell in love with archaeology and the country and the people. And I met some graduate students on that project, and I was able to ask questions about graduate school because I knew nothing about it. And so I had never considered it. And some of those graduate students are still friends of mine. One I married. So for any students in the audience, know that at any level, you can get involved in the department, get to know faculty and their work, talk to graduate students. You never know what kinds of opportunities may be available to you. And for graduate students, form cohorts and communities, because one day down the line, you may be collaborating with them, sending students to them, or being presented with job opportunities to them, or asking them to give talks in your department. You never know. So I'm still friends with many of the people from UCF and from graduate school, so I consider them a lifesaver, and I'm honored to know many of them. But even after leaving UCF, I returned year after year to Caracol, and I gained more experience excavating and with lab work. And almost always I was asked to excavate ritual context. So it's no coincidence that my research would go in that direction. But first, I'll just explain a bit as an aside. So at the site of Caracol in Belize, which is a lowland Maya site, there is this common practice of constructing mausoleums or shrines for the dead on the eastern side of a patio group, a residential patio group. Of course, not everyone gets this kind of burial treatment, but in these structures that do tend to be the most elaborate structures, there are evidence for repeated acts of veneration, and you see where they continually go into these buildings to add more burials, and they revisit these buildings to add offerings. And so these structures are always on the eastern side of a patio because the cardinal directions are highly significant in Maya ritual practice, and east specifically is often ritualized because this is the direction where the sun rises every day, and it's directly tied to cycles of birth and death and renewal. So every year when the Caracol Archaeological Project excavates residential groups, they would inevitably find these spaces. And if you put an excavation in an eastern building, chances are it will be a mortuary shrine. And I was usually in those excavations. But what I found particularly fascinating was the kinds of materials that would be found in these spaces, in these contexts. Such a diverse array of stuff would be offered, stuff that you can see here in this particular offering that come from far off distances, and they're often in varying states of completeness or fragmented. This offering, it has barnacles and stingray spines, sea worms, and mind you, the ocean is over 90 miles away from the site of Caracol, which is in the jungle and the mountains on the border of Guatemala and Belize. But also in this offering, a single jade bead, limestone rocks, which are so common, it was clearly just picked up from the local landscape. And what was rarely identified, but almost always present, is these colored soils and sediments. I mean, clearly residues of organic stuff, organic remains. And you could often tell that these offerings, these caches, were just one part of a complex series of actions, because it's common to see evidence of burning in and around these spaces, intrusion, replastering. I mean, these places were highly active. And I got really close to these materials through illustrating them. So another one of my roles on this project was as an illustrator. All cataloged artifacts, particularly those from ritual contexts, would be illustrated using the standardized convention of technical illustration. It requires careful measuring, close examination of the surface features. And this work provided a chance to integrate another one of my hobbies, which is art. Up until then, I had no idea that art could be a part of archaeology. But if an illustration is done well, and it's detailed enough and measured accurately, you should be able to glean information such as crafting techniques, surface wear or decoration, texture, and through the use of pattern charts, you can also convey color as well. So illustration provides information that photographs often don't include. And so over the last 2 weeks of every field season, my husband and I would sit in a hut for 12-hour days measuring and drawing artifacts. So much so that every night I would dream in graph paper. But it's through this work that I learned to analyze lithics, because I had to illustrate every single flake scar, every trace of cortex, damaged edges. I would take, more formal classes on lithic analysis later, of course. But this intimate interaction with things, holding them, feeling their surface, noting their details, you can see traces of a history to that thing. For example, I put this greenstone figure of a monkey. It's a hard stone, and yet it was clearly intentionally smashed. A piece was broken off of it before it was placed in this shrine area above a burial. The other piece of this monkey was never found and presumably was carried away. So as a master's student at the time, it was this fact that I thought was really interesting. I mean, why do that? Why break it? Why not leave it whole? I found this book on enchainment called Parts and Wholes, Fragmentation in a Prehistoric Context. It's by an archaeologist named Chapman. But at the beginning of the book, he describes attending this funeral event for a friend of his, and they're asked to smash this pottery at the event, and they get to carry away a piece of the pot, a shard from the pot afterwards, which may sound strange, but I think his friend was a ceramicist, so it makes sense. But the point is that this piece that was carried away will forever link Chapman to that event and to that funeral, and by extension to his friend. So reading that kind of thing, those kinds of things with that in mind, seeing artifacts from this point of view began to make sense. And I would make a concerted effort when I illustrated them to know every detail, if they were broken, if they were burnt, if there were scratches or gouges on them. And I say that because early practices and illustrations tend to represent artifacts kind of in their ideal and their whole form, even if they were found broken. But this was the rabbit hole that I was venturing into, this fascination with things and the relationships that humans have with things in certain contexts. And I began to read more and more what archaeologists had to say about the matter. And one in particular stood out to me. Rosemary Joyce was writing extensively about materiality and about Maya ritual. And maybe even extensively is an understatement. Sometimes I feel like she writes books in her sleep. But I found her at UC Berkeley, and I met her in person. I flew to UC Berkeley to meet her in person and talk about it. As a naive and unexperienced academic, I wasn't really thinking about UC Berkeley's department or institution. I just wanted to work with her. And so we hit it off both as two upstate New Yorkers, and we talked about stuff, right? And she encouraged me to apply to work with her at UC Berkeley. I don't know how, but I got in. It was a fluke, but I got in. But while I was in Berkeley, I did take advantage of any kind of volunteer opportunity, any project that I could be a part of. And so often graduate students in that department would volunteer at different projects in the community. One of those opportunities was working with the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. And I believe Alan Farahani also volunteered on this with us as well. But I got the opportunity to actually help design this archaeology exhibit that would coincide with the terracotta soldiers coming. This was a temporary exhibit. So the terracotta soldiers from the first emperor's tombs, they were hosting it, and they wanted an exhibit on archaeology to teach the community how archaeologists do what they do. And so for that exhibit, I designed and illustrated a set of life history panels that essentially follows the life history of one of those artifacts, a lesser known artifact, which was actually the armor that's made of all these limestone tiles and strung together with copper. We chose that artifact, and we developed these life history panels, following them from the quarrying of the limestone to the shaping and the piecing together to the burial in the tomb to the subsequent sacking of the tomb, and then ultimately its display in San Francisco. So once again, I got to use kind of my joy of art and integrate that into archaeology. So maybe I think a lot of my opportunities have to do with just enjoying art and drawing. All right, let me see. There we go. So also while I was there at UC Berkeley, I was asked to help a previous student of Rosemary's on her artifacts, which were being stored in Mexico City at UNAM, the national university there. And she wanted help illustrating and analyzing her lithics, but also pottery and figurines as well. And so I'd go there, I went there a couple times, spending a few weeks at a time, illustrating her artifacts and analyzing her lithics. And while I was there, I got to know another archaeologist, which is Rodrigo Liendo, who has spent the last like 20 years surveying around all these smaller sites in the area around Palenque. And he and I got to talking about my interest and my experience excavating certain contexts and talking about his work. And he told me that after nearly 2 decades of working in the area around Palenque, he wanted to begin actually working in the city itself to understand the city of Palenque as the political center for many of those secondary settlements. And would I like to work with him? And I said, absolutely no way. Just kidding. But I spent my time in graduate school reading and ruminating on what makes ritual distinct as compared to other practices, even when otherwise mundane objects and materials are part of those events. What makes the experience of those events distinct? And for this, 2 things that I read really stood out to me. And one of those is Richard Bradley, an archaeologist that works in prehistoric Europe, who uses this term ritualization as a way to describe a way of acting where certain parts of life are selected and provided with an added emphasis. I like that added emphasis. And Ed Swenson is also an archaeologist who works in South America. He talks about the amplified materialization as what makes those moments unique as an experience, and that those that are part of the event have a heightened awareness of interconnectedness and the relations between things. So as I discussed in the volume coming out that Karen mentioned, that's finally coming out this summer, these moments from the view of the event are heightened moments, or as Alfred Gell calls B series events. These are isolated happenings that stand out against the A series events, which are the time imminent, the repetitive tempo of the everyday. So these moments tend to run together, right? They blur in your memory, and the things that we interact with in those moments may not garner much attention as special in any way. But in those periodic elevated moments that are the events, they can have a larger impact on memory. They stand out as distinct moments. And in those moments, the experience of materials are heightened. So that a pot that maybe once was on a shelf or held water or used to store water was simply a pot, but when it is smashed at a funeral and a piece of it is taken away, it takes on different qualities. So taking my previous experience and knowing that often in excavating these types of contexts interpreted as ritual deposits in the Maya area, they are usually just one component. The offering is just one part of the event. And even those offerings, we often only find the visible, the durable stuff, leaving out much of the organic stuff that in and of itself would have ignited the senses, right? Flowers, food, incense, all the things that tend to degrade. So I planned a project to go to Palenque and be prepared to kind of sample and try to recover as much of those perishable stuff as I could. and approach it as looking for traces of events. And so considering its temporality and its materiality, using those suite of methods that I was being introduced to at UC Berkeley. I wanted to recover as much of the materials that would have been part of those events. So at UC Berkeley, I learned about all these different methods, which I'm sure some of you are learning about in your archaeology classes as well, that we have at our disposal that can recover perishable materials such as plants or residues. But also methods like micromorphology that allow you to view the in situ layering of soils and sediments under a microscope. So thinking about ritual as eventful, but also materially rich, this method really appealed to me as a way, as an innovative way to analyze ritual. Because this method is concerned with formation processes over time and explicitly concerned with the relationships between individual components in thin section. So with this method, these intact blocks of soil are taken from a context, say a quote unquote ritual deposit. They're impregnated with epoxy resin and then ground and polished and sliced into thin section, and then you can look at it under a microscope. And then you look to identify all the arrangement and the size and the frequency of different components in the soil fabric. Typically, this kind of method is used to reconstruct paleo environments or anthropogenic alterations to the landscape because it simultaneously you have to be familiar with the local geology, soil formation processes, and kind of post-depositional alterations. But I was specifically interested in the anthropogenic signatures because work outside of the Maya area has shown that different human actions such as trampling or burning or sweeping, that they can leave a distinct kind of signature in thin section. And you can often see certain elements that are not visibly macroscopically, like phytoliths, the microscopic remains of plants. And so what drew me to this method was a way to kind of examine microstratigraphy, trying to narrow down our time frame to a singular event. We're used to dealing with large blocks of time. And so actually being able to discern individual depositional events so that we could talk about the past in terms of a lived generational time, rather than more of an abstract kind of multi-century kind of block of time. So as an interdisciplinary, a multi-institutional project collaboration between UNAM and UC Berkeley and now UNLV, we're coming together to investigate domestic life in the city of Palenque and investigate parts of urban life that are still largely unstudied at Palenque, such as crafting and industry, diversity of urban identities, the extent of state level involvement in economic and domestic life in this city. So just a bit about Palenque. It was a city that's built to hug the side of the mountainous Sierras. So you can kind of see on the map to the left here. It's in Chiapas in southern Mexico. To the south, that is the steep kind of elevation of the mountain. It backs right up to the mountain. And essentially they had to shape these kind of limestone shelf on the side in order to build on it. And then you see numerous rivers actually run off the mountain, run through the city, and they form these flat alluvial plains out to the north. So the city is elevated and kind of has this view all the way across nearly to Tabasco. The city itself is actually quite small. The bulk of the city is only 2 kilometers east to the west. So that's about 1.5 miles. You can walk from one end of the city to the other really easily. But within that city, it's actually quite dense. There's over 1,400 structures that have been mapped in this city. So it's estimated around 5,000 to 6,000 people live there. And with that kind of density, it's considered the third most densely occupied city in the Maya lowlands. They were essentially living on top of each other with very little kind of open space in between. And during the late classic period, around 700 or 800, while they were filling in this whole area, they had to build additional terraces off the mountain to accommodate additional settlement. For over 2 centuries, though, work has been done at this city. As you mentioned, it's pretty well known for that reason. In fact, this one Maya site has the longest history of exploration and investigation compared to any other Maya site. It began when this area was still part of New Spain in the 1700s. They were already sending people there, recording and clearing the site and sending reports back to officials. So we've known about this site for quite some time, and there's been a lot of work there. But the majority of that work has remained concentrated in the city center, where the largest, most elaborate structures are clustered, including the palace compound. As you see up in the left-hand corner, this is a big platform with multiple structures in the tower. This would have been the kind of primary administrative area for the kingdom. The Temple of the Inscriptions down on the bottom corner there is the largest funerary shrine at the site and built for one of Palenque's most well-known or most visible rulers, King Pakal. The ball court and a large complex of temples collectively known as the Cross Group, as many of them have, they all have an inner sanctuary with iconography of the world tree. It's like a cross, the axis mundi for the Maya. So these areas we know quite well. And in these spaces of the palace and the temples and the royal tombs, overwhelmingly are the images of elite men, namely the rulers, including Pakal on the right. You see his bust and his sarcophagus lid. His son, Akal Monab, on the left, and on the bench on the bottom. When there are others included in the scene, accompanying nobles or priests, they are also typically young men. Even though we know that Pakal lived until his 80s, he was never depicted as an elderly man. Same is true of his sons. And rarely are women depicted in public monumental art, usually a mother or wife, and they are typically to the side holding the costume elements of the regalia for the central figure. Rosemary Joyce has written about this at length because it's not only at Palenque where this is the case, it's quite common for many of the Maya political centers to have this kind of overly represented segment of society, but clearly it represents a restricted view of Maya society, because where are the elders and the children and the non-royal women? And there have only been a few archaeological investigations in the residential groups at Palenque, and all have been concentrated in the areas directly surrounding the city core, the downtown area. And they're all very elaborate, stone-built, often multi-story complexes. They're not humble houses of the poor. These are the homes of the city's elite. And in these residential groups, there are a number of patterns that suggest there were these overarching trends that are directly related to their shared social circles, primarily the kinds of items they had access to and their burial practices. But again, this leads to the impression that Palenque's population was homogeneous. In one recent book on Palenque, it was suggested that it may be indicative that this city had a higher than average elite population relative to commoners as compared to other Maya cities. But this is the impression that you get when you take a macro scale perspective. But we know in Maya society, even the wealthiest houses, those of the most powerful elite, were heterogeneous corporate collectives. They were made up of men and women and elderly individuals, may have also included slaves children, of course. So individuals that don't always appear in the monumental art or as part of the written text on the city's walls or depicted on the fancy pottery. And so this is where intensive investigations of individual households can be revealing of a city's diverse population. So in 2016, our team, Proyecto Regional de Palenque, began excavations of one of those elite residential groups known as Group 4. This group was first discovered in the 1950s when they were cutting the road into the archaeological park. And when it was being cleared, they clipped the backside of one of the structures, one of the largest structures in this group. And so when they ventured in to see what structure they had damaged, they found this cluster of structures situated around a central patio, which is typical for a private residential group in the Maya lowlands. Typical in the Maya lowlands to the east at sites like Caracol and Tikal in the Petén, but not so typical for Palenque, actually. This is not actually that common to have this kind of arrangement, this private patio arrangement. But much of the architecture was still standing, with the exception of some roof collapse. But you can see from the plan map here of this group that it has that kind of cardinal arrangement where you have structures arranged to the north and the south and the west and the east. And you can tell just by looking at the map, these structures clustered on the eastern side, these small pyramidal shaped clusters, are unique as well. The largest structure on the western side and the southern side, those are multi-level structures with a series of rooms and benches. So those are most likely the spaces where everyday activities are happening. The picture, the photograph, is actually structure J2 on the south. But this house was an old house. The people that lived here from the time of the earliest days of Palenque's sudden florescence during the mid-500s, all the way through to the city's decline in the 800s. And so this arrangement, as we see it here, was its latest form. It actually grew over time. It wasn't always like that. But this residence is also unique as compared to any other residence in the city because it's the only residence with hieroglyphic texts on stone tablets, nearly identical in theme and style to those that you find in the palace. So outside of Group 4, there are no residential groups that we know of that had this. And the stone tablet, it was found set into the back wall of one of those small rooms on the second floor of the main structure here that you see in the photograph. And this tablet, it's known as the Tablet of the Slaves because they're actually sitting on captives as seats. And the accompanying text actually describes, it gives you a whole narrative of an individual named Chaksuts, who has a title, he's ranked, he has a title of Sahal, which is second only to the king. It's typically a lower lord, it's a political rank. But in the description also describes him as a military captain who defeated these secondary centers in war out in the region. He claims to have captured a few captives. He acquired multiple captives. And then at the end of the text, it explains that this tablet was commissioned in celebration of his third Khatun, or his 60th birthday in 704. Also found in this general area on the second floor of this structure was this really detailed stone incensario stand of typical Palenque style, with this very lifelike image of this man's face. And the flanges on the side have text that gives names and dates and information like rank and certain events. And so this individual on the left-hand side in the incensario is identified as Aj Sul, also claims to be a military captain and working under Pakal himself during the 600s. So clearly this residence is home to some of Palenque's most influential elite. But outside of the epigraphy and the life of these two men, there was still much to learn about the mundane, everyday activities, as well as the periodic ritual events that were carried out there. We know that Chaksuts and Ashsul were not the only ones living here, as is typical. The majority of men, women, and children that worked or supported the economic activities in this house were left out of the written history. They're not depicted on incensarios or in the tablets. So what can we say about them? Many others working in the Maya area have done. We've looked to activity areas, knowing that tasks in a Maya household tend to be gendered or age-based, with the processing and production of food, overwhelmingly done by women and their children, as well as weaving, tending to household gardens, maintaining the household altar, also typically done by women, with children presumably helping with many of those tasks, such as fetching water, tending animals, getting firewood. There was an entire volume devoted to the archaeology of childhood in Mesoamerica by Tracy Ardren and Scott Hudson that discusses the role of children and the invisibility of children in our narratives. But in addition to the products of their labor, the activity areas, the food remains, the crafting remains, we also find smaller portable art such as figurines that display a wider variety of gender and age and occupation. And there are the bodies of men, women, and children of varied ages that are buried in the patio of this residential group. And as I'll talk about in a second, the burial treatment, the health and the injuries and the body modification, there is considerable diversity. So we focused our work behind the main structure, knowing that often the ancient Maya would dispose of their trash and their scraps behind their homes or off the backside of a patio. And after excavating this area over multiple seasons, we know that this household had a diverse cuisine that's rich in meat from the local rivers, so fish and turtle, freshwater snail shells we call hute, is still eaten today, and also turkey, deer, dog. But they were also disposing exhausted stone tools and debitage and flake stone debris, suggesting that there was some household crafting or at least maintenance of tools. So they're not extensively working stone and making stone tools for market or anything. But this seems to be more of a small scale household based. In addition, there's signs that they were working and crafting bone. So finding half-finished bone ornaments and the byproducts of working in bone and broken bone pendants. So even in this elite household, there was a small amount of crafting, at least for household purposes, not for market or extra household economic needs. But in addition to that, after doing a bit of remote sensing, we also know that on the eastern side, it was very clear something was going on in the patio. We focused on the eastern side of the patio, knowing what we know about the significance of the East in these patterns that we've seen elsewhere. But also there was some previous archaeological work in this group, and they had found some burials on the eastern side, but we could not have expected just how many more burials would be found there. So this site is, this residential group is the site of the city's only known cemetery, and one of only 2 identified cemeteries in the Maya area, the other one being at Copan. It's not common to find such a concentration of burials in one place. I believe now we're at over 100 individuals. Normally you find isolated burials here and there, so together we could kind of paint a picture of the diversity and the heterogeneous nature of this elite household. And as we expected, some of the burials were reserved for the leading household members, those that would become the house's ancestors. Those individuals were buried in the mausoleums, but everyone else was buried in the patio. And so you see as it's mapped here, this is the latest version of this residential group. Some of these structures would be later additions. The on J1 and J2 on the western side and the southern side were connected by an elevated platform with a single stairway. That area appears to have been a kitchen area for cooking. The Maya tend to cook outside, not in the confines of the small stone rooms with no ventilation. And then on the eastern structure, again, you know, with my experience at Caracol, kind of already knew what this would be. It was a mausoleum structure. It's the oldest mausoleum structure. It's not constructed as a functional building, though. It's unique. You can see there's no door you can enter. There are no interior floors or entryways. It was constructed more as a monument. The structure as it looks here, this is the last moments of an extended life history to this space. Once I excavated the inside of this structure, it became clear that there were a series of events that happened in this space spanning over 200 years. And all of those would eventually be encased in this structure. And you can kind of see its irregular shape is another indication of a long history of use and modification and expansion. So in order to reconstruct the life history of this space, I excavated down to bedrock into this structure. And so the cross section here of the structure actually shows the earliest events all the way down to bedrock, all the way up to the actual building of the structure eventually would just encase everything inside. But again, there's no interior surfaces or entryways. This was not a building you were meant to walk into. Instead, this entire late classic structure encased an earlier altar that would have been exposed and sitting on the patio for roughly 80 or 100 years, so 2 generations. And there were a series of events that happened here, and each isolated context were intensively sampled. Block soil samples were taken, loose samples for flotation for plant remains, carbon was recovered in each one of these discrete kind of concentrations. And so we get a sense for just how old this building was. And think about this in lived times, you know, I always tell students in terms of like, how old is our country, right? You have one single household that persists for you know, multiple hundreds of years. So the deepest kind of concentration of stuff down by bedrock, this would have been the first occupational surface and some of the oldest kind of activities that happened there. And in this area, there was extensive burning, a large cluster of ceramics, over 1,500 kind of layered ceramics, mostly courseware and water jars and such. In also allspice and pine. Allspice is a kind of a spice. It has a smell. It has a distinct smell. Pine as well, when it's burnt, it's a very unique kind of odor, sweet kind of smell. Pine is not local here at Palenque. They had to import pine, and actually it's been demonstrated that pine is used in ritual quite often. In terms of compared to other kind of fuel, pine is preferred, and even among some contemporary Maya groups, pine is a large component of some of these ritual events, including foodstuff. The hute, the freshwater snail, we find that in almost every one of these kind of ritualized contexts and associated with burials as well. So this clearly was a favored food. And turtle and fish, all coming from those local rivers. And also in that context was, as you can see, a whistle. So instruments also very commonly found in ritual contexts in the Maya area. So this was a whistle of a woman's torso. She's wearing this kind of elaborate huipil, and she's with the neck. It was burnt, her head is missing, but also part of that context. And they would have had to dig into and intrude into that layer at some point or later on to construct this crypt. And this crypt was constructed in this kind of cruciform shape. So it had these two niches on the east and the west side to hold the offerings for this individual, this adult male, as it was found. The photo actually shows you, so I had to excavate through an altar, and that's where the burial was. So I suspected that the altar may have been above something, and so that proved to be the case. And so this crypt was underneath that altar, and it had this single male individual who was, he was wearing some very fancy shell earplugs with the jade dangling beads. Nobody in the patio had this kind of jewelry. He was only given a single bowl in one of those niches, but he had a spindle whorl at his hips. This is an interesting pattern that I would see again, the inclusion of weaving tools, and almost always in and around the hips, they would place bone needles, spindle whorls, bone awls associated with these burials, but also evidence of cinnabar. So his bones had traces of red pigment. Again, nobody in the patio gets this kind of treatment. He not only was given this marked space, but this cruciform shaped crypt, we only see this outside of group 4 and associated with rulers in Temple 18A had this kind of cruciform shaped crypt. So not everybody gets that kind of treatment. Directly above his, what would have happened after is they built an altar, this large, like almost nearly perfect 2 meter by 2 meter altar on top of his grave. And you can kind of see these areas on the altar surface that were burnt. So they repeatedly came to this space and carried out these kind of burning events. So this quick little drawing is just meant to show that this is early in the household history. So 500s, very early in terms of Palenque history as well. And so the house was not complete at this point. So this altar would have just been just an altar isolated. There was no structure yet later on. So at that time, the altar was in use for roughly 2 generations of visiting this altar and making these offerings that's associated with the grave below. Around the altar, though, again, if we want to talk about amplified materialization, around the altar was just these great concentrations of materials and burning, scorching. And so luckily, prior to excavating this structure, I had arranged for some of the analysts from UNAM to analyze the faunal, the plant remains, the soil chemistry of any surfaces. And I'm glad that I did, because some of these concentrated areas just had so much material to process. And this appears to have been a feasting or ceremonial event, because we have here a collection of over 251 freshwater snail shells. So we have this large cluster of hute freshwater snail, representing the majority of all the hute snail that was found inside this excavation. 5 whole fish were burnt in situ. Turtle remains, over 3,000 sherds, a high concentration, and these sherds are mostly decorated servingware. The flotation and the macrobotanical revealed that this also included beans. Chicosapote produces a fruit, an edible fruit. Allspice used for flavor. Again, pine is another common type of fuel in these kinds of events. And in the scorched area where the fish was found, also a whole incense burner with its lid was left right in that spot, burnt right there. And it was full of the sticky kind of remains of both copal and pine. Interesting aside, just kind of a story on the side. Before we entered the graves, one of the members of the community, he came to kind of carry out this little ceremony, and he brought his little incense burner and copal and pine. It was almost exactly what I would later find in the excavation, even the shape of the little incense burner. So that was kind of interesting. But Julia Hendon has discussed the role of feasting in these elite households as a means by which certain houses would gain prominence by hosting these events. And the bulk of the burden for these feasts would fall on the women, right? So they're responsible for providing and preparing the food. In this case, even though the feast was meant for the dead, that was directly below the altar. But the altar too may have been the responsibility of women. There are multiple areas of burning. We know that it was used over and over again, and there are ethno-historical accounts that detail the burning of incense and placing offerings on the household altar as part of a woman's daily chores. But among the ceramics, as I said, were some of the most decorated and incised and polychrome vases and plates. And here's just a couple examples where we have these polychrome vessels and incised vessels of the fish and the individual with his little breath bubble, and a little figurine of a plump woman seated there holding a bundle or something in her lap. All of that was found in that context. And simultaneously, I was also taking a series of block soil samples from each one of these areas, from the altar surface, from the strata below, in these areas where this, this feasting context occurred as well. And there are a few observations that I wanted to make mention of that came out in the micromorphology that we would not have detected macroscopically, that I think are quite interesting in terms of thinking about the individualized actions. One of those is the sample taken from the altar surface. What you see here is it's highly weathered. All the plaster components are dislodged because Palenque is just inundated with so much water every year that it's highly weathered. And so it should be of no surprise that this altar would have required a bit of maintenance. And so at some point during those 2 generations, roughly 2 lived generations, one of those generations would have had to replaster the altar. And so we have evidence that one replastering event must have happened. One of those components has this layer of new fresh plaster. So that was something to make note of. And also in the burning area on the altar surface, evidence of this kind of burnt fibrous plant material also seen in thin section here. So we know that this silky kind of cotton is very similar to the ceiba tree, and the ceiba, also considered the world tree. That iconography is all over the city of Palenque, clearly significant. But again, also the micromorphology was helpful because it confirmed that big feasting event, this was just one single event. There was no layering to suggest it was a continual accumulation of stuff. It was one event that happened there. And so eventually at some point, the next generation, and I have a series of carbon dates, so these are pretty tightly dated. After that altar was exposed for and used for about 2 generations, clearly the individual directly below was still in living social memory. They built an entire structure to encase the whole thing, the altar, the burial, everything. They built this structure around it. So what you see in that cross section, that's all structural fill, big limestone rocks and everything used to make up the bulk of the structure to bury all of this within. And that happened at a time when they were adding burials in the stairs. But before they were done finishing this structure, they carried out 2 more burning events. So there were in the construction fill these small concentrated areas of burning. No artifacts in it, just plant stuff that we now know. It was mostly pine, malvaceae, which is a part of the ceiba family, so possibly ceiba as well, and allspice. What's interesting is the same combination of plant stuff occurs repeatedly in many of these ritual contexts. After that mausoleum had been in use for multiple generations, during the late classic period, they built another mausoleum structure in the corner, structure J6. And that also, and I'm looking at the time here, so I'm going to kind of go a little bit faster. Again, same thing here. It was constructed for one single individual. This one single adult male was buried in the core of this structure. He does not get the cruciform shaped crypt. Trends have shifted and that's fallen out of use. But again, he's coated in red cinnabar. He's given special treatment there. He has bone needles at his hips or at his pelvis, and he has multiple vessels placed at his feet. And those were sampled for microbotanicals. And so those plates and the vase have remnants of maize and manioc in them. So he was given these kind of food offerings, and he had very fancy jewelry that we don't see with those individuals out in the patio. Clustered in and around those structures, though, almost every available space in and around these mausoleum structures were burials of men and women and children, and multiple layers, some of them superimposed on each other, spanning over 300 years. They continually returned to this site and continually buried their dead here, including even in the inset corners of those mausoleum structures. Many of the burials had additional secondary burials, bundles of burials at their feet. So they would reopen some of these graves to add additional people. And they were not given jade jewelry, they were not coated in red cinnabar, given that kind of treatment, but there's still considerable diversity in terms of how they were, the kinds of materials they were given, and how they were buried as well. That many of the primary burials are extended with the head to the north, and they're given a couple vessels at their feet. There is a number of them have weaving tools, so weaving continually, clearly an activity that was happening in this household, and so these weaving tools are often found in graves. Some of the graves have little collections of hutate snail shells, so that food item as well. Also interesting too, in keeping with the prevailing kind of bodily practices and adornments typical of Palenque, a number of the men and women buried there had their teeth filed into a variety of different styles. And I'm using this kind of classification system that was published that shows you the different style teeth that are found in many of the individuals. And multiple styles of the cranial modification are present. Some of those with individuals as young as 6 years old were already, shaping their crania and shaping their teeth. And this is not just reserved to the most elite. I mean, the individual in that old mausoleum, he did not have his crania shaped. He did not have his teeth shaped. And different age groups are represented here in the inset corners. This large water jar was had a newborn baby, a neonate in it, was buried in the inset. And then there's just two to make note of, because clearly not everyone in this group was an equal member of the house or had the same level of influence or authority. And it has been noted before that there are slaves amongst the Maya, or servants or captives. And so there are two burials that kind of stand out as unique because they include individuals that are injured. They have evidence of increased health issues. One of those burials, burial 9 here, the drawing here, was a single adult male that was tightly flexed, buried with his arms behind his back. And the way his head was positioned, he had a stone kind of crushing one of his orbitals. And on the left-hand side, there were two, a subadult and adult male that were included in an offering that coincided with a primary individual. And I had Jenny Burns look at this. One of the femurs is crushed. Looking at the photograph, she thinks it was crushed. Somebody from INA suspected that maybe it was a nutritional deficiency, but she doesn't agree with that. But in any case, you can see the one femur clearly deformed. It's almost a teardrop shape when it should be circular. So this individual had a very serious kind of injury they were living with. And their teeth are highly worn, so very different than the rest of the group. So these individuals kind of stand out. And so this will be kind of our efforts going forward. All of the burials are going to be they're having stable isotope analysis done. We already know some of them are foreigners. They come from other sites. They're going to have ancient DNA done to kind of get a sense for the level of, matrilineal relationship or kind of kinship to see whether that is the case. But in the upcoming years, our goal is to venture out of group 4 and actually begin exploring neighborhoods to get a sense for diversity in this city. And for that, we need to get into these houses, and intensively examine these houses. All right, thank you. What time is it? Okay, it's only 12:30. Sorry, guys. Anybody? Let me see. Let me put on my chat.
I'm unmuting. I don't know if, yeah, Peter's still here. So let's see, do we have any questions in this chat? So it is 12:30. So I think if anyone wants to leave, they should feel free to log off if you need to get somewhere. If they don't, and if Lisa has 5 or 10 minutes, we stay for a couple questions. Lisa, do you need to run?
Yeah, I have a couple minutes if anybody had a question. Sorry,
Okay.
I don't take much time for questions, but if you do.
That's okay. It was a fascinating talk. I enjoyed it at least. So Ian Ford did have a question. How common is the association of weaving implements with male skeletons? Also curious as to the frequencies of large versus small spindle whorls. Notice that some of the larger ones look highly decorated. So if you have any comments on that.
Okay, so Ian, I am not sure if they were working with agave fibers. I know that's what you are interested in. And so those spindle whorls are still, we haven't analyzed them in terms of looking at their diameters or looking for patterns for that yet. And yes, it is common for weaving tools to be included with the burials of men, and this has actually been written about. It doesn't suggest that men had to have been the weavers. There's other reasons why they would bring those with them in death or be given those kinds of gifts. But yeah, it's common to find weaving tools in the burials of both men and women.
Does anybody else have any questions?
And there's no remains of agave that I know that have been recovered in the site as of yet. Of all the PEB stuff we've done, there's no remains of agave that I know of yet either. I don't know, because of where we are in the world, whether that's going to be a thing. Oh, I'm sorry, what's this question here? Do we know if the individuals from the cemetery are local or migrants? Also, are those same individuals arranged in a specific manner? Yeah, so that extended burial with the head to the north and the feet to the south overwhelmingly is the Palenque pattern for those primary burials, but they also tend to add, as I said, reopen the grave later on, and they'll add bundles of people at their feet or at the side of them. That is a pattern. We're now understanding some of the stable isotope stuff does suggest that there are some people that moved into Palenque from other sites, like Chiniquija, some neighboring sites, so they're not all local. So yeah, the way that they're arranged doesn't seem to follow some kind of pattern that's, sex or age-based or anything. There are sub-adults that are also given that kind of primary extended burial with the head to the north as well. Let me see, is there any other questions?
Looks like one more question from Nate. Was the skull shaping and teeth shaping a status symbol?
Yeah, no, actually, that's why I made a point to mention that the individual in the Eastern Mausoleum, clearly this individual was the one that was given this kind of special treatment. He did not have his cranius shaped or his teeth shaped or with the inlays or anything. So, and the individual number 9 with his arms behind his back, he had his teeth filed into various shapes. So it doesn't appear to be that it's restricted to status or influence, or it's something else.
Well, Jonathan posted one. Why don't we let this be our last question so everybody can get maybe, but this is
the impact filed teeth had on daily life or health. Oh, that filing them actually causes damage to your teeth, that kind of thing. I'm sure. A lot of people have spent a lot of time looking at dental practices. There's even a publication that a dentist on Maya practices of dental modification. So yeah, I'm sure.
Sounds like we need some experimental archaeology, and we just
no, because they would have been using stone tools and water probably. So no, thank you. Thank you again, everyone that was able to sign in. And I'm sorry I went a little bit over. It's a lot to talk about, but I'm happy to talk about it again as we learn more stuff from different households. I'm excited to do that.
Okay, thank you so much. What a great talk.
Have a good day, everyone. I'll see you in the next program.
Okay, bye.